Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is your UPSC News analysis for June 10th, 2025. Our mission in these deep dives is to take the stack of sources you provide, break down the key current affairs, explain the essential concepts, and highlight the issues most relevant for aspirants tackling exams like the UPSC. Today, we're discussing a range of important topics straight from the news of the day.
That's right. The sources for June 10th cover quite a spectrum, from internal security challenges and governance issues to shifts in foreign policy, innovative environmental efforts, and socioeconomic concerns. Think of us as your guides, pulling out the absolute most important nuggets of knowledge and insight from this material you've curated.
Okay, let's unpack this stack. We'll start with a look at internal security, specifically the complex situation in Manipur. The sources highlight a significant development regarding peace efforts there.
Yes, what's interesting here is the report that after a 2-year pause, the Union Home Ministry resumed a dialogue on June 9th. This was with representatives from the Kukizo groups who are part of the suspension of operations agreement.
Suspension of operations cell. Yeah. For anyone needing a quick refresher based on the sources, what exactly does that entail?
Well, the sources explain SOO as a tripartite ceasefire. It's been in place since 2008. It involves the government of India, the Manipur state government, though the sources do note they withdrew back in early 2024. So these recent talks were primarily MHA and the Kukizo groups directly, and various insurgent groups are part of the original pact. The core idea is simple, really. The groups halt their operations, they stay in designated camps, and they engage in peace talks. And the Kukizo groups, they're distinct ethnic communities in the Manipur Hills. Their long-standing demand currently is for Union territory status with its own legislature.
Right, and this dialogue is happening amid the violent ethnic clashes between the Meitei and Kukizo communities that erupted back in May 2023. The sources really stress the context here. Blocked highways like NH2 and NH37, often called lifelines for the Imphal Valley, arms looting, and just widespread civil unrest. It's a difficult backdrop.
Absolutely, and the sources highlight key points on the table for these resumed talks. Things like revising the SOO rules, crucially discussing the opening of those blocked highways. That's a major sticking point. Also, the relocation of some insurgent camps, addressing that Union territory demand and figuring out the surrender of looted weapons. That's critical. And while the state government wasn't at the table for this particular round, the sources mention a positive tone. It suggests a central push for some kind of settlement.
Okay. What broader frameworks or government actions are mentioned in the sources regarding this conflict? Are there specific interventions?
Yes. Beyond the Severo Pact itself, the sources reference MHA coordination, significant deployment of security forces, army, paramilitary, and definitely a push from the center for a political solution, not just security measures. There's also a mention of constitutional provisions. Article 355 comes up. That's the center's duty regarding internal disturbance. And the 6th schedule, which provides for autonomous district councils in certain tribal areas, that's relevant to governance structures in the hills,
This situation clearly has major implications. What are some of the key main relevance points the sources draw out?
Well, the sources point squarely to the deep ethnic divide and the lack of trust as fundamental challenges. It's deep-seated. The demand for a separate administrative unit that touches on sensitive questions of state integrity, naturally, and the circulation of looted arms. That remains a very serious security threat. Plus, the economic impact of highway blockades is just devastating. It contributes to social polarization and mass displacement. The sources note around 70,000 people displaced. Huge number.
70,000.
Yeah. It tests center-state relations and raises these tough ethical questions about balancing peace efforts with accountability for the violence that's happened.
Right. And looking ahead, what does the source material suggest as way forward? Any potential solutions mentioned?
The sources emphasize confidence-building measures. CBMs, finalizing revised SOO rules, maybe with timelines, ensuring arms surrender with proper monitoring, engaging civil society is mentioned too, and exploring autonomous governance options, but, and this is stressed, within the existing state framework, not through territorial division. Promoting inclusive development and maintaining transparency are also seen as crucial.
Okay, that gives us a clearer picture of the Manipur situation based on the sources.
Okay.
Let's pivot now to a different kind of security challenge, maritime safety. Our sources report on a cargo vessel fire off the Kerala coast.
Indeed. The news for June 9th included a fire on a Panama-registered cargo ship, the MV Maharshi Devatreya. This happened off the Vizhinjam coast in Kerala.
Okay. Can you give us a quick overview of India's maritime security context and the significance of that stretch of coastline based on what the sources say?
Sure. India has this vast coastline, right? And the sources make a useful distinction between the Indian Navy, which is focused on military defense, and the Indian Coast Guard, the ICG. They're responsible for maritime safety, pollution control, search and rescue, SAR operations, more of a constabulary role at sea, and the Kerala coast specifically. It's on a major international shipping lane in the Arabian Sea. A huge percentage of India's trade flows through there. The International SOLAS Convention Safety of Life at Sea for merchant ships, it's also very relevant here.
Got it. So this incident involved a fire about 45 nautical miles out. What do the sources say about the response?
It triggered a joint rescue operation. Both the Indian Navy and the ICG were involved. The good news is 18 crew members were rescued. But tragically, the sources report 4 are still missing. They mention various ICG and Navy vessels like INS Sharda and ICG ships Samar and Akinav, plus aircraft, were involved in the search and rescue. The preliminary cause, suspected to be an engine room fire, which led to heavy smoke. And there's also an environmental concern flagged the potential for an oil spill affecting the marine environment. Always a risk with ships.
Definitely. What official frameworks or interventions are mentioned in the sources related to maritime safety in incidents like this one?
The sources point to a few key bodies. There's the National Maritime Search and Rescue Board, the NMSRB, which is led by the ICG, and the Directorate General of Shipping, or DGS. They implement international maritime norms, like SOLAS. There's also the Marine Pollution Contingency Plan, MPCP. Recent efforts mentioned include strengthening ICG stations and expanding the Integrated Coastal Surveillance Network, the ICSN. Constitutionally, Article 51C regarding international obligations is relevant, and India being a signatory to UN SOLAS, the Law of the Sea Convention.
What main relevance points stand out from this incident according to the sources?
Well, the sources highlight issues like potentially inadequate fire safety compliance on some vessels. That's a recurring theme globally. Also, the challenge of rapid response to incidents far offshore and the environmental vulnerability of India's coast. Kerala's coast is ecologically sensitive. The impact is felt across crew safety, obviously, but also economic disruption to shipping and that potential environmental damage. It really underscores the need for robust regulatory enforcement and coordinated disaster handling between agencies.
Makes sense. And a way forward suggested by the sources what needs to be done.
Suggestions include stricter enforcement of those SOLAS norms, regular joint training exercises between Navy and ICG, upgrading SAR infrastructure, better real-time marine traffic monitoring is mentioned, enhancing marine pollution response capabilities, things like skimmers and booms, and boosting regional cooperation with other Indian Ocean countries.
Okay. From maritime safety, let's shift focus now to India's diplomatic engagements. Our sources report on the Prime Minister's upcoming travel plans.
Yes, the news indicates that PM Modi's planned trip to Canada in early July 2025. Well, it's set to include official visits to Cyprus and Croatia as well.
Interesting. That suggests a broadening of India's foreign policy focus. What context do the sources provide for visiting these particular countries, Cyprus and Croatia?
The sources frame this within India's push to, diversify partnerships, especially within the EU, and strategically engage with smaller European states, not just the big players. It also links to increasing Indian interest in the Mediterranean. Partly driven, the sources suggest, by the IMC project, the India Middle East Europe Corridor. Cyprus is an EU member known for generally supporting India. It's relevant as an investment hub and a potential IM node. Croatia is also EU and NATO, seen as an emerging market IT, pharma, tourism, and a maritime country, so potential in shipbuilding, blue economy.
Right. And the sources mentioned this visit comes as India is sort of recalibrating its relationship with Canada after the Niger row and actively diversifying its outreach within the EU. So what are some key areas of cooperation highlighted for Cyprus and Croatia in the sources?
For Cyprus, the sources specifically mention maritime cooperation and updating the tax treaty. That connects to investment flows and IMC links. With Croatia, the focus seems to be on areas like shipbuilding, tourism, pharma exports, and digital connectivity. The overall diplomatic objective, it seems, is to consolidate India's presence in southern Europe.
Okay. What existing frameworks or initiatives are relevant here? What's the bigger picture?
While the EU-India Strategic Partnership Roadmap 2025 provides a framework, and the ongoing India-EU FTA negotiations, the free trade agreement talks, that's the broader backdrop, the outreach to smaller states like these, it helps build political support within EU forums. It's smart diplomacy. The sources also connect this to a look west in Europe policy, maybe a geostrategic shift, potentially influenced by global events like the Ukraine war, and aimed partly at balancing other initiatives like China's BRI and the constitutional basis, Article 51, promoting international peace and cooperation. That's the foundation.
Got it. So what's the main relevance of these visits, according to the source material?
The sources point to challenges like managing those strained ties with Canada and navigating EU bureaucratic processes, which can be slow. But the visits aim to boost the economy through new markets, investment potential via Cyprus, perhaps using its favorable tax regime, although the treaty update aims to address concerns there, and potentially strengthening that IMC route. Politically, it enhances India's diplomatic footprint and status, including in the Mediterranean region.
And the way forward, suggested by the sources, what should India focus on?
Concluding the India-EU FTA quickly is highlighted, building IMEC partnerships, maybe with specific nodes in Cyprus or Croatia, leveraging maritime diplomacy, enhancing digital cooperation, especially with Croatia's ICT sector, proactively addressing diaspora concerns, particularly in Canada, and using soft power are all mentioned as future steps.
Okay. Shifting gears entirely now, let's look at a critical domestic issue: water security. Our sources feature an innovative approach being implemented in Rajasthan.
Yes, this is interesting. The sources spotlight an innovative farm pond model being piloted in Kukas village, which is in the Jaipur district of Rajasthan.
India faces significant water stress, we know that, particularly in semi-arid regions. What context do the sources give for this issue and the role of farm ponds?
Well, the sources note that around 60% of Indian districts face groundwater stress. It's a huge number. And in regions like Rajasthan, agriculture heavily depends on unpredictable monsoons, and groundwater is being pumped out unsustainably. Farm ponds themselves aren't new. They're small structures to capture rainwater runoff. But the innovation here, highlighted in the sources, is the use of durable plastic lining. This significantly reduces water loss through seepage. It makes these ponds much more efficient for irrigation, especially year-round for horticulture and for supporting livestock.
Right, efficiency is key.
Exactly. And in Jaipur district specifically, the sources state 99.4% of irrigation comes from groundwater, far exceeding the recharge rate. So the situation is critical there.
Wow. The project in Kukas involves 50 such plastic-lined ponds. What were the main objectives?
The aim was to harvest a large volume of water. The estimate mentioned is around 10 crore liters collectively. This provides reliable water for irrigation and livestock, thereby boosting farm incomes and making them more resilient to drought. The design is quite specific, 10 feet deep, occupying about 5% of the farmland, with that crucial plastic lining. The sources definitely see this pilot as having potential for scale-up across similar regions.
Okay. What government schemes or initiatives are relevant here? Is there support available?
Yes, central schemes like the PM Krishi Sinchai Yojana, PMKSY, which promotes water conservation and micro-irrigation, are relevant, specifically the watershed development component. Rajasthan also has its own initiatives, like the Mukhya Mantri Jal Swavlamban Abhiyan, and NABARD supports some projects. The constitutional context includes Article 48A on environmental protection and Article 21, which the courts have interpreted to include the right to clean water.
Makes sense. What's the main relevance of this model based on the sources?
The sources directly tie it to addressing challenges like irregular monsoons due to climate change and that critical issue of groundwater depletion. A challenge mentioned is the high initial cost of lined ponds, so financial support is needed, especially for small farmers. But the impact is positive, empowering farmers, enhancing water security, diversifying crops, supporting the rural economy. Environmentally, it helps with runoff management and could potentially aid groundwater recharge in surrounding unlined areas or through managed aquifer recharge.
And a way forward, how can this be expanded?
Scaling this model across other semi-arid regions, Bundelkhand is mentioned as an example, providing financial support, using technology, maybe ICT tools for monitoring water levels, integrating it with solar-powered drip irrigation for even greater efficiency, encouraging community participation for maintenance, and linking it with schemes like MGN REGA for construction labor are all suggested in the sources.
That's a really interesting example of local innovation tackling a national challenge. Now let's turn to a very different kind of international news. This one involves conflict and activism as reported in the sources.
Right. This news from June 9th involves the Israeli Navy intercepting a vessel. It was attempting to break the Gaza blockade. an aid boat organized by the Freedom Flotilla Coalition.
Okay, so can you give us the context here?
Yeah.
The Gaza Strip, the blockade, and this Freedom Flotilla, what are they according to the sources?
Sure. The sources describe the Gaza Strip as controlled by Hamas and under an Israeli blockade since 2007. Israel states the primary aim is preventing arms entry. Humanitarian aid is allowed under international law, but it must comply with blockade rules, meaning inspection, usually via designated crossings. The Freedom Flotilla is described as a civilian movement specifically aimed at challenging and attempting to break this blockade by sending aid ships directly by sea. And the sources mention that climate activist Greta Thunberg was among the activists on this intercepted vessel.
Interesting. The boat was reportedly carrying medical supplies and food. What happened after the interception, according to the sources?
The sources report the Israeli Navy intercepted the vessel and temporarily detained the activists on board, including Thunberg. This incident, according to the sources, triggered quite a bit of international debate about the legality and morality of the blockade itself. Israel defended its actions under the rules of maritime blockade, while activists argued it was contrary to humanitarian law, hindering essential aid.
Right, two very different perspectives. How does India figure in this context, based on the sources? What's India's stance?
India's position, as described in the sources, supports a two-state solution for the Israel-Palestine issue. It calls for respecting international humanitarian law, like the Geneva Conventions, which protects civilians. India has previously sent aid to Gaza, but through official channels, typically via Egypt. The sources highlight India's balanced approach, maintaining good relations with Israel while continuing moral and developmental support for Palestine.
Okay. What's the main relevance of this incident? What are the broader implications?
The sources point to complex issues around the legality and proportionality of prolonged blockades. Some argue it amounts to collective punishment. Also, the difficulty in balancing a state's security needs with humanitarian access for a civilian population, and the role of non-state actors like activists in international conflict zones. That raises ethical debates too. The impact is felt acutely by civilians in Gaza facing shortages. And globally, it strains diplomacy and fuels debates at the UN.
And the ethical dimensions.
Yes, ethical questions about civil disobedience versus state sovereignty and the effectiveness and ethics of such activism.
What way forward is suggested in the source material?
The sources call for urgent international mediation for sustainable humanitarian corridors, not just temporary aid delivery, pushing for a ceasefire, reviewing the blockade's legality under international law, promoting Track 2 diplomacy. And India's continued balanced approach is noted as important in this context.
Okay. Moving back to domestic security challenges now. Our sources report on a persistent issue in Chhattisgarh.
Yes, unfortunately, the news includes a tragic incident from June 9th in Bijapur district, Chhattisgarh. Additional SP Deepak Sharma was killed in a Maoist IED blast.
This really highlights the ongoing challenge of left-wing extremism. Can you provide context based on the sources? What is LWE?
Left-wing extremism, or LWE, led primarily by the CPI, Maoist, is described in the sources as a major internal security threat. Their stated aim is to overthrow the state through armed struggle. It's concentrated geographically in what's often called the Red Corridor parts of Chhattisgarh, Odisha, Jharkhand, etc. And IEDs, improvised explosive devices, are highlighted as a key deadly tool used by these insurgents. They're low-cost, effective, particularly in ambushes and difficult terrain.
Right. The incident involved an IED detonating during an anti-Maoist operation, injuring others as well. It shows the continued capabilities of the Maoists despite government efforts. What are those government efforts, according to the sources?
The sources reference the National Policy and Action Plan to address LWE, which dates back to 2015. It's described as a multi-pronged strategy. It involves security operations, yes, but also development initiatives in affected areas and addressing rights issues. Security measures include strengthening forces like the CRPF and its elite Cobra units and using technology like UAVs for surveillance. Development focuses on improving infrastructure, roads, telecom, and providing special central assistance, SCA funds, to affected districts. And constitutionally, Article 355 is relevant again, highlighting the center's duty to protect states from internal disturbances.
Okay. What main relevance comes out of this persistent issue? What are the key takeaways?
The sources point to the challenges posed by Maoist guerrilla tactics like IEDs and ambushes. The difficult terrain and sometimes local support aid the insurgents. There is a need mentioned for improved intelligence gathering and better interagency coordination on the ground. The impact is significant. It hinders development projects, creates fear in local communities, affects civilians caught in the middle, and poses a serious internal security threat that undermines state authority and governance in certain pockets.
And what way forward do the sources suggest to tackle this?
Suggestions include improving ground-level human intelligence, which often means better community engagement, leveraging non-contact warfare technologies, drones, maybe AI for analysis, focusing on area domination and holding cleared territory, strengthening police capacity and training. Crucially, addressing the root causes: land rights, forest rights, effective delivery of welfare schemes, promoting dialogue with any factions willing to talk, and ensuring human rights compliance during security operations is also stressed.
This really reminds us of the complexity and persistence of certain internal security challenges. Now, related to social issues, our sources also report on a significant public health crisis and a government response in Punjab.
Yes, the news indicates the Punjab government has announced a comprehensive drug rehabilitation policy. This is in response to what the sources describe as a sharp rise in drug abuse cases there.
What's the context for the drug problem in Punjab as described in the sources? It's been in the news for a while.
It has. Punjab faces extremely high rates of drug abuse, tragically. The sources mention it's fueled by narcotics inflow, particularly heroin and synthetic drugs, often from across the Indo-Pak border. The socioeconomic impact described is devastating: high unemployment, rising crime rates, and a major public health emergency. While rehabilitation efforts exist, the sources note challenges: inadequate infrastructure, especially in rural areas, very high relapse rates, difficulties with social reintegration due to stigma, and a lack of sustained post-rehab support.
Okay, so what are the key features of this new policy mentioned in the sources? What's different?
The sources mention plans for integrated rehab centers in all districts. That's a significant scaling up. Also, mandatory post-rehab skill training linked to employment opportunities. That's key for reintegration. The use of AI-based systems for patient tracking and monitoring progress is mentioned as an innovative feature, and building community-based peer support networks to help prevent relapse. The overall goal seems to be a crucial shift, moving beyond just short-term de-addiction towards long-term recovery and social reintegration.
Sounds comprehensive. What broader frameworks or government initiatives support these kinds of efforts?
Well, there's the National Action Plan for Drug Demand Reduction and a PDDR run by the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment, and the Nasha Mukh Bharat Abhiyan, the Drug-Free India campaign, where Punjab is actually a focus state. Punjab itself has initiatives like the 008T clinic's outpatient opioid-assisted treatment. The legal framework is primarily the NDPS Act, the Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances Act of 1985. It covers control but also treatment and rehab aspects. And constitutionally, Article 47 places a duty on the state regarding public health, including efforts to prohibit intoxicating drugs harmful to health.
Right. What's the main relevance of this drug problem in the proposed solution?
The sources point to major challenges: that inadequate rural rehab infrastructure, the high relapse rates, mentioned as 60-70% in some contexts, often due to lack of social and economic support post-treatment. The stigma attached to addiction hinders employment and reintegration. The constant inflow of new types of drugs complicates treatment. And that cross-border smuggling aspect links it to security. The impact is profound on families, mental health, crime rates. Women and children often suffer disproportionately. It reduces economic productivity and increases public health spending.
And the ethical side.
Yes, the need for humane, rights-based rehabilitation is stressed, avoiding a purely punitive mindset towards addicts, seeing it as a health issue.
And the way forward suggested in the sources, beyond this specific policy.
Scaling up and standardizing rehab facilities with a focus on rural areas, implementing that AI tracking effectively, strengthening peer support models, ensuring the mandatory skill training and job placement actually happens, tightening border surveillance using technology and better coordination, elaborating with civil society and faith-based groups to reduce stigma, and fostering regional cooperation with neighboring states is also mentioned, as drug trafficking doesn't respect borders. Continuous evaluation is key, too.
Okay. Addressing public health crises like drug addiction clearly requires these kinds of multifaceted approaches. Now, on the environmental front, there's news of a significant step towards managing a different kind of waste.
Yes, the sources report that the Delhi government is setting up India's first e-waste eco-park. It's planned for Holambe Kalan.
E-waste. Why is this such a concern in India, and what exactly is an eco-park in this context?
E-waste is basically discarded electronics, phones, computers, TVs, appliances. They contain hazardous materials like lead and mercury, but also valuable resources like gold, silver, copper. India is a massive generator, the sources mentioned being the third largest globally. The problem is most recycling happens in the informal sector. This is often unsafe, releasing toxic fumes, polluting soil and water, and harming workers' health. An eco-park, as described in the sources, is a formal, integrated facility for the safe collection, dismantling, segregation, and recycling of e-waste. It aims to do this scientifically, promoting a circular economy and preventing harmful informal practices.
Got it. What are the specific features of this Delhi park mentioned in the sources?
It's planned over 20 acres. It's intended to have state-of-the-art processing technology. It will act as a reverse logistics hub, coordinating collection from across Delhi NCR. And importantly, it includes a skill development center to train workers, potentially from the informal sector, in safe handling and processing methods. The main goal is to formalize Delhi's currently fragmented and largely informal e-waste sector.
Okay. What regulations or initiatives are already in place for e-waste management in India?
The e-waste management rules 2022 are central. They mandate extended producer responsibility, or EPR. EPR means producers of electronic goods are responsible for collecting and channeling back a certain percentage of the e-waste generated from their products. There are specific collection and recycling targets. The Central Pollution Control Board, CPCB, is the nodal agency for monitoring compliance. The sources also make the connection that government initiatives like Digital India and the Production-Linked Incentive (PLI) schemes for electronics manufacturing, while boosting the economy, inevitably lead to more electronic consumption and thus more e-waste down the line.
Right, a double-edged sword.
Exactly. Constitutionally, Article 48A, state duty to protect the environment, and Article 21, right to life, interpreted to include a clean environment, provide the backing.
What's the main's relevance here? Why is this eco-park significant?
The sources highlight the key challenges. Over 95% of India's e-waste is still handled by the informal sector, leading to those toxic emissions and health risks. There's low public awareness about proper disposal and segregation. And a lack of efficient formal collection infrastructure hinders the system. The potential impact of the eco-park is positive. Societal benefits through safer formal jobs and better public health. Economic benefits from recovering precious metals, boosting the circular economy, creating green jobs. And politically, it shows leadership from Delhi and could serve as a model for other Indian cities.
And ethical considerations.
Yes, enforcing producers' responsibility through EPR is an ethical dimension. Also, ensuring justice for workers currently in the informal sector, their inclusion, upskilling, and transition to safer work.
And the way forward suggested by the sources.
Scaling up this eco-park model to other major cities seems logical. Strict enforcement of the e-waste rules, particularly monitoring EPR compliance. Incentivizing reverse logistics, getting the waste back efficiently. Engaging and integrating the informal sector, not just displacing them, mass awareness campaigns for consumers on segregation, promoting urban mining recovering materials, and linking skill development here with the broader Skill India mission.
That does sound like a promising step for sustainable waste management. Now let's return briefly to Manipur. Recent events reported in the sources seem to have triggered renewed unrest there, connecting back to our very first topic today.
Yes, that's right. The sources report mass protests across the Imphal Valley on June 9th. This followed the arrest of a prominent Meitei leader.
Okay. This is within the context of that ongoing ethnic conflict we discussed earlier. What details do the sources provide about this specific incident and its immediate aftermath?
The sources state that the arrest, carried out by security forces, led to widespread protests in Imphal. Shops shut down, transport was hit, and there were clashes reported with the police. Crucially, the sources note fears that this arrest could potentially destabilize or derail the fragile center Kukizoso talks that had just resumed. It highlights the extremely complex dynamics and the deep-seated mistrust between communities and sometimes towards the authorities. Internet services were also suspended again in some districts, a measure often used to curb rumor-mongering but also impacting communication.
Right. What government actions or frameworks are relevant to this ongoing unrest, as mentioned in the sources? We touched on some earlier.
Yes, beyond the SO talks themselves, the sources reference the Unified Command Structure, which aims to coordinate operations between the army, paramilitary forces, and state police, and the existence of relief camps, housing those approximately 70,000 displaced persons, a stark reminder of the human cost. Constitutional links mentioned again include Article 355 and the 6th schedule related to hill area governance, though the source notes its specific application and effectiveness in Manipur is complex and contested.
Understood. What main's relevance does this particular flare-up underscore? It seems very sensitive.
Extremely sensitive. The sources highlight the deepening ethnic polarization, the fragility of trust between communities, and sometimes between communities and the state apparatus. Allegations of state bias, whether perceived or real, can erode faith in institutions, which is dangerous. It shows the difficulty of balancing law and order enforcement with the need for political negotiation and reconciliation. There are also concerns noted about lagging progress on rehabilitation and delivering justice for victims of the violence over the past year.
And the impact.
Continued displacement disrupts lives, education, livelihoods. The economic impact of instability and potential blockades is huge. It tests center-state relations and challenges India's image internationally. Governance itself becomes difficult neutral policing, restoring basic services.
And the ethical side of handling such arrests.
Yes, the sources implicitly raise the need for upholding the rule of law transparently, while also protecting minority rights and ensuring that law enforcement actions are perceived as just and not politically motivated, especially in such a charged environment.
Given this complexity, what way forward is suggested by the sources?
Ensuring a transparent legal process for the arrested leader to avoid any perception of a vendetta. Intensifying community peace-building efforts involving civil society from all sides. Securing the safe and dignified return of displaced persons, which means addressing the gaps in rehabilitation support. Maintaining strict neutrality and professionalism by security forces is paramount. Using confidence-building measures actively. And ultimately moving towards a sustainable political settlement that reviews governance structures and addresses the root socioeconomic causes of the conflict. Controlled internet access, rather than complete shutdowns, might also be considered.
That really shows how intertwined and delicate these issues are in Manipur. Okay, finally, let's look at one more development concerning center-state relations, this time on the fiscal side, also reported in our sources.
Right. This news involves the Tamil Nadu government approaching the Supreme Court. They alleged the center had halted the release of certain education funds under centrally sponsored schemes, or CSS. And the sources also report the Supreme Court's initial response to their plea for an urgent hearing.
Okay, before we get into the specifics, what's the basic context on Senate-state finance and the role of the SC in these kinds of disputes, according to the sources?
The sources explain that center-state financial relations are governed by various constitutional provisions. Article 282 allows the center and states to make grants for any public purpose, giving flexibility. Articles 275 and 280 deal with statutory grants and finance commission devolution, which are more structured transfers. CSS are schemes where the center provides significant funding, but implementation often involves the states. Education and health have many key CSS, like Samagra Shiksha Abhiyan for school education, or PM Posham, the midday meal scheme. States relied heavily on these funds. Judicial review, primarily under Article 32 for the SC, allows the court to examine government actions. If withholding funds potentially violates constitutional duties or fundamental rights, like the right to education under Article 21A, the SC can intervene.
Understood. So what was Tamil Nadu's specific allegation in this case, according to the source?
The source states that the Tamil Nadu government alleged that the withholding of these specific education funds under CSS was potentially political retaliation. They claimed it happened after the state government had opposed certain central government policies. Now, the sources report that the Supreme Court declined an urgent listing of the plea. The court said it would take up the matter in the regular course, not immediately. Tamil Nadu's argument, as reported, was that stopping these funds violates the fundamental right to education, RTE, guaranteed under Article 21A, and disrupts essential school programs like midday meals. The sources frame this entire episode as highlighting rising tensions and friction in center-state fiscal relations, which seems to be a recurring theme lately.
What's the main relevance of this kind of dispute over CSS funds?
The sources point to several critical issues. First, the perception or reality of political bias influencing fund release. This undermines trust. Second, the fiscal dependency of many states on central funds, especially CSS, making them vulnerable. Third, a lack of transparency sometimes cited in the criteria or timing of fund releases under CSS. Fourth, the potential threat to constitutional guarantees like RTE if funds essential for their implementation are stopped arbitrarily. And fifth, the broader issue of rising center-state friction, which can hinder effective governance and potentially lead to policy paralysis if cooperation breaks down.
What about the impact?
The immediate impact is on school children, potential disruption to education programs, midday meals. It can affect teacher morale and state education budgets get stressed. Politically, it strains the federal structure. It fuels the debate between cooperative federalism versus a more confrontational model.
And ethically.
Ethically, the sources suggest that if fund stoppage is politically motivated, it violates principles of fiscal justice and fairness within the federal system. And using essential services for children as collateral damage in political disputes is obviously problematic.
Given these issues, what does this source suggest as a way forward? How can such disputes be managed better?
The sources suggest an urgent need for more transparent and clearly defined mechanisms for CSS fund release, reducing discretionary power. Maybe an independent oversight body, perhaps strengthening the role of institutions like the Finance Commission or the Interstate Council. A general push towards more untied grants via the Finance Commission route, giving states more flexibility, is often debated. Clarifying center-state roles and responsibilities, especially under new frameworks like the National Education Policy, NEP 2020, where TN has raised objections. Fostering cooperative federalism through continuous dialogue. Encouraging states to enhance their own revenue generation for sectors like education, and ultimately, an authoritative Supreme Court ruling on the limits of the center's power to withhold funds under CSS could provide clarity. Looking across all these topics we've covered today, from the sources from the ethnic conflict and Maoist insurgency to maritime safety incidents, foreign visits, innovative water management, the Gaza aid boat situation, drug rehab policies, e-waste parks, and these center-state funding disputes. What really stands out is this incredibly intricate web of governance challenges India faces pretty much daily. Each solution proposed, each intervention made, seems to have consequences that ripple across society, the economy, and the polity. It really raises the question, doesn't it? In navigating all these complex issues, how can we, as a system, best balance the immediate needs and pressures with those long-term constitutional values and ethical considerations? That's something important to consider as you reflect on these deep dives.
Subscribe for daily updates and drop a comment to share your thoughts. Please join the Telegram channel link given in the description to read this news and solve a quiz based on this. Jai Hind.